She arrived in chains stripped of name, homeland, and future, sold into the most secretive prison of the empire, the Sultan's harem. Yet within these velvet-draped walls of gilded captivity, one woman would seize the impossible. Known to the West as Roxelana and to her master as Hürrem, she rose from concubine to queen, from slave to sovereign influence. How did a foreign captive seduce not only the heart of Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, but also the machinery of imperial power itself? Why did she, alone among thousands, earn a legal marriage, shape foreign policy, and build monuments in her name? This is not merely the tale of ambition, it is the undoing of an empire's unspoken rules and the birth of a new kind of power, feminine, foreign, and feared. The machinery that brought Roxelana to the gates of Topkapi was not a moment of misfortune, but the result of a system mechanical, precise, and merciless. Across the borderlands of Eastern Europe, raiders sanctioned by the Crimean Khanate scoured villages with the efficiency of a harvest, seizing girls whose only crime was beauty or youth. These were not merely slaves, they were investments, commodities destined for the inner sanctums of empire. Sold in the bustling slave markets of Constantinople, Christian captives were funneled into the imperial harem, a place misremembered in the West as a den of luxury, but in truth, a gilded labyrinth of surveillance, discipline, and hierarchy. The Topkapi harem functioned as a state institution, a political engine cloaked in silks and silence. Every movement was observed, every glance weighed. Girls were renamed, re-educated, and reconditioned. They were taught Ottoman Turkish, converted to Islam, and drilled in the arts of poetry, music, etiquette, and submission, not for pleasure, but for power. At its core, the harem was a battlefield, and beauty was a weapon. The concubines who bore sons for the Sultan became valid candidates, mothers of potential heirs. Competition was not open, but ritualist centuries of unspoken rules dictating how a girl might climb from bedding to influence. The stakes were existential. To remain unnoticed was to rot in a windowless chamber. To rise too quickly was to vanish in scandal or poison. Those who endured walked the tightrope between seduction and strategy. The chief eunuch, himself a master of palace politics, ensured order and whispered alliances to those who could pay with secrets. And towering over all, unseen but ever present, was the specter of the Velite Sultan, the Sultan's mother, whose control over the harem was absolute. Into this maze of ambition and containment stepped a red-haired girl from Ruthenia, sold, renamed, and presumed forgettable. But unlike the others, she laughed. She earned the name Hürrem for her strange, unsettling joy, a joy that defied the architecture of despair around her. That smile was not naivety, it was the spark of calculation. For in the empire's most surveilled prison, where obedience was a currency and silence a shield, she did not cower. She studied. She adapted. She watched the women who succeeded and those who disappeared, learning that survival required more than beauty, it demanded mastery of 1,000 invisible games. The harem was not merely a prison, it was a crucible. And within its walls, a slave would become a sovereign. She arrived barefoot, bruised, and nameless, another forgotten girl fed to the palace's silent hunger. Yet from her first days within the walls of Topkapi, it was clear that this new concubine refused the role of ornament or shadow. While others sobbed into their silks or froze beneath the gaze of eunuchs, she smiled. She laughed. Her voice, incongruously light in a place made heavy with rules, drew sideways glances from those who had learned to speak only when summoned. The name came quickly, Hürrem, the cheerful one. A word passed first in whispers, then in wary admiration. It was not joy she expressed, but audacity, an unsettling refusal to let pain erase her. In the eyes of the trainers, who expected submission wrapped in grace, her sharp tongue and gleaming eyes marked her as dangerous. She asked questions no one else dared. She learned Turkish with uncanny speed, memorized palace rituals, and corrected instructors under her breath. Her wit, uninvited, became a spectacle. When an older concubine mocked her foreign accent, Hürrem replied with a rhyme so clever that even the stern eunuch beside them failed to hide a smile. But this defiance was not childish, was weaponized. She quickly discerned the architecture of power hidden beneath the silks, the invisible rankings among the women, the alliances forged over shared secrets. the punishments disguised as protocol. She studied how the chief black eunuch deferred only to the Valid Sultan, how whispers carried farther than screams, how laughter disarmed cruelty more effectively than tears. In a place designed to dissolve identity, where names were stripped, pasts denied, and all were reshaped into a single mold, Hürrem rebuilt herself, not by conforming, but by standing out. Her voice became her shield, her memory a blade. She never forgot the faces of the slave traders, the smell of burning roofs in her village, the weight of the chains on her ankles. But she wore that memory like armor, hidden beneath layers of charm and cheer. It was this paradox that began to unsettle the hierarchy. Beauty was expected, many were beautiful. But intelligence, sharpened by suffering and cloaked in laughter, was something far more dangerous. The Khalifas, senior women of the harem, began to watch her more closely, not merely as a curiosity, but as a threat. She attracted not only the amused tolerance of her keepers, but the cold suspicion of rivals. She was not the prettiest, nor the most obedient, but she was the one no one could quite predict. In an empire built on hierarchy and silence, unpredictability was a kind of power. The girl called Hürrem did not ascend through favor or seduction, not yet. She ascended by surviving a world engineered to erase her, and doing so with a smile that mocked the very system trying to break her. It began not with ceremony, but with a shift barely perceptible at first inside the rhythms of the palace, like the changing of a current beneath still water. Sultan Suleiman, newly ascended and yet unshaken by the burdens of empire, began to summon Hürrem more often than any other concubine. What began as infrequent indulgence became routine, then expectation, then obsession. He laughed at her cleverness, entertained her opinions, and lingered in her presence longer than protocol permitted. The harem, bound by centuries of silent laws, held its breath. For tradition dictated that each concubine bear a single son, after which she would be dismissed from the sultan's bed to prevent factionalism and intrigue. But Hürrem bore one child, then another, and was never dismissed. She remained in Suleiman's favor, and more dangerously, in his chambers. Whispers twisted through the marble corridors. Some said she used spells, others said poison, but most simply feared what they could not understand. Hürrem had become more than a concubinage, had become a disruption. Her continued presence violated the established rotation of desire and inheritance. She gave birth to 5 of Suleiman's children, including multiple sons, in direct defiance of imperial custom. It was not lust that kept her there, it was strategy, and the sultan's unprecedented willingness to ignore the muttering jaws of his court. Mahidevran, Suleiman's former favorite and mother to his eldest son Mustafa, seethed in displacement. Her political position, once secure, eroded under the daily spectacle of Hürrem's continued ascendancy. Courtiers aligned themselves accordingly. The chief black eunuch, the grand vizier, and even foreign ambassadors began to notice the strange gravity Hürrem exerted, not through decree, but through presence. She did not yet sit in council, but her shadow reached it. She smiled while rivals plotted, knowing that to remain beloved was to remain invulnerable. But such favoritism came at a price. The palace was not merely watching, it was calculating. For every child she bore, Hürrem deepened the rift between her and the traditions she shattered. Every son was a political grenade, threatening the balance of succession and igniting whispers of civil war. The Ottoman Empire had long insulated itself from such chaos through the harem's quiet rules, but now, those rules had been ignored. Suleiman, intoxicated by Hürrem's wit and companionship, abandoned the very customs designed to protect his dynasty from internal fracture. It was not love that unnerved the court, it was deviation. For in the halls of empire, deviation was danger. And Hürrem was no longer simply a cheerful girl with a clever tongue, she was a storm in silks, wrapped in laughter, leaving shattered precedent in her wake. The day the Sultan married a slave, the empire held its breath. Legal marriage between a reigning Ottoman sultan and a concubine had not occurred for over 2 centuries. Such unions were forbidden not by law, but by something stronger, tradition. Marriage meant obligation, permanence, legitimacy. Concubines could be discarded, exiled, forgotten. Wives could not. Yet Suleiman, in a move that stunned both his court and foreign envoys, officially wedded Hürrem. The act was as explosive as any war, a rupture not just in protocol, but in the very philosophy of Ottoman rule. The imperial household, built upon the delicate choreography of concubinage, succession, and maternal rank, had been rewritten by a single signature. Hürrem, once property, was now sovereign. She did not bow in the shadows of the harem but stood as consort married in ceremony, named in correspondence, and dressed in authority. Her new status forced even the Grand Vizier to recalibrate. Foreign ambassadors sent dispatches filled with disbelief and speculation. The Venetian bailo described her as the Sultan's equal in influence, and the Polish king responded to her letters with deference. Within the palace, the implications were seismic. Her children were no longer merely the sons of a favored woman, they were now sons of the Sultan's wife. Succession, once a blood-slicked dance of half-brothers born from competing mothers, now tilted toward Hürrem's line. Mustafa, son of Mahidevran, once the uncontested heir by seniority, now faced rivals with royal legitimacy behind their names. And Suleiman, by placing a legal crown upon Hürrem's head, had transformed not only her fate, but the very architecture of Ottoman inheritance. Etiquette shifted overnight. Courtiers now bowed lower in her presence, wary not only of her favor but of her permanence. The women of the harem, once her rivals in silence, now moved like shadows behind her. She was no longer a candidate for influence, he was its embodiment. Portraits began to circulate with her likeness, and poets penned verses in her honor. She commissioned public works in her own name, her seal joined to imperial decrees. She was not merely Suleiman's delight, she was his queen. But with elevation came peril. As her profile rose, so too did the daggers of jealousy and dissent. To some, she was a usurper, a manipulator who had bewitched the Sultan and hijacked centuries of imperial design. To others, she was a miracle, the embodiment of merit rising above birth. Either way, the marriage marked a turning point. The empire would never again be ruled by men alone. In wedding Hürrem, Suleiman did more than honor a lover, he carved a new path for power, one where the harem no longer ended at the lattice screen, but extended defiantly into the very heart of the throne. When Hafsa Sultan died in the spring of 1534, it was not merely the passing of a matriarchate, was the collapse of the last bulwark standing between Roxelana and the total dominion of the imperial harem. As the valid sultan, mother of Suleiman, and the empire's highest-ranking woman, Hafsa had long acted as a check against the ambitions of concubines, even as she quietly tolerated Hürrem's rise. Her death removed the single figure who could command deference from both the sultan and the harem without question. Into the vacuum stepped Roxelana, not cautiously, but with the assertiveness of someone who had prepared for this moment for years. She moved quickly, installing her allies in critical positions, handmaids, scribes, tutors, even eunuchs loyal not to the memory of Hafsa or the old traditions, but to the new order taking shape beneath Hürrem's gaze. The hierarchy of the harem, once opaque and slow to shift, was suddenly fluidly structured to reflect Hürrem's vision of centralized control. She rewrote the unspoken laws that governed behavior among women, dismantling the cliques that had favored her rivals and replacing them with a web of allegiance centered on her. Rooms were reassigned, duties reshuffled, even the flow of information what the Sultan heard and from whom began to filter through her couriers. No longer just a consort or even a wife, Hürrem became the de facto governor of the inner palace. She oversaw not only the training of new concubines, but also the education of her sons, aligning tutors to her ideological interests and keeping detailed records of their progress. Her influence seeped outward into the administrative arteries of the empire. In salons and private quarters, poems praised her beauty and intellect, always circulated anonymously, always traced back to those hoping to curry favor. Gifts arrived at her quarters from foreign ambassadors, not protocol, but offerings. She responded with grace, wit, and, when necessary, silence. Within months of Hafsa's death, a new regime had emerged within the haremless, traditional, more hierarchical, and wholly dominated by Hürrem. And it was not just palace walls that bent to her will. Across Constantinople, the city felt her touch. Her patronage of religious foundations, her visible presence in court ceremonies, her name whispered with both awe and unease. What had once been a quiet power exercised from behind a veil was now unmistakably direct. Some saw her as the empire's new mother figure, compassionate, enlightened, invested in the future of Ottoman rule. Others, particularly old guard officials, viewed her as a corrupter of sacred balance. But none could deny her hold. The harem, once governed by the memory of the past, now pulsed with the vision of a woman who had outlived her enemies, surpassed her station, and mastered the most complex court in the Islamic world. The death of Hafsa did not mark the end of an era. It marked the beginning of Roxelana's reign. Power, in Roxelana's world, was never seized openly, it was suggested, echoed, written between the lines of a letter or murmured behind a silk curtain. With Hafsa Sultan gone and the harem under her full control, Roxelana turned her gaze outward, not to challenge the Sultan, but to shape the very decisions he believed were his alone. Behind the gilded screens of Topkapi, her political mind sharpened with astonishing clarity. She began to cultivate relationships beyond the empire's inner sanctum, corresponding with foreign monarchs like Sigismund II of Poland, exchanging gifts, diplomatic courtesies, and carefully worded suggestions cloaked in the language of peace and piety. These were not the idle musings of a courtly woman, they were calculated moves on the chessboard of empire. No Ottoman woman before her had ever taken such liberties, and yet there she wore her seal affixed to letters that would influence regional diplomacy. Within the divan, the imperial council, her presence was felt not in person but in effect. Viziers advanced or fell based on how they aligned with her interests. Her allies rose swiftly, men who understood that the Sultan listened more intently when certain arguments were whispered after nightfall in the quiet of his private chambers. She was not officially seated at the table of state, but her voice lingered in every decision made there. Matters of war, taxation, internal rebellion all passed through Suleiman, but more and more were softened, redirected, or intensified by Hürrem's unseen hand. The Grand Vizier, Ibrahim Pasha, once confident in his autonomy, began to sense the tide turning against him. His policies, once praised, were now quietly questioned. His foreign alliances, especially those with European powers, came under scrutiny. Some say Roxelana viewed him as a threat to her son's futures, others that she simply could not abide a second power center beside the Sultan. Whatever the truth, the erosion of Ibrahim's influence coincided with the full flowering of her own. Scholars and chroniclers began to refer to her not just as Haseki Sultan, but in more hushed tonesas, the Kadun Padisha, the woman sovereign. It was not just a title, it was a statement of reality. And the Sultan, far from resisting, welcomed her counsel with increasing frequency, valuing her intelligence as much as her loyalty. She mastered not only the politics of personality, but the bureaucracy of empire, learning which documents mattered, which officials could be swayed, and how power flowed like water slowly, but always downhill to those who knew where to dig the channels. Roxelana did not rule by decree, but by gravity. Ministers bent toward her, decisions tilted in her direction, and all the while she maintained the mask of decorum, a mother, a wife, a devout Muslim woman offering advice for the good of the realm. But behind that mask lived a strategistone who had learned that in an empire where men wielded swords and titles, a whisper, if well-timed, could change the fate of nations. It was a silence more violent than any sword stroke, the kind of silence that follows the removal of an obstacle so deeply rooted it had once seemed immovable. Mahidevran, once the proud consort and mother of Suleiman's firstborn, Mustafa, faded from court with no formal dismissal, no ceremonial departure, just banishment to the provinces, a quiet exile that echoed like thunder through the harem's corridors. Was it coincidence that her fall followed Roxelana's marriage, her tightening grip over court appointments, her whispered counsel in Suleiman's most private hours? Or was it designate invisible hand rearranging the pieces for a succession long foreseen? The court speculated, foreign ambassadors recorded, and enemies muttered behind closed doors, but none could prove what they feared most, that Roxelana had orchestrated the slow destruction of her greatest rival, not through open malice, but through patience and strategy. Yet it was not Mahidevran's exile that cast the longest shadow, it was the death of her son. Mustafa, the empire's eldest prince and a favorite of the army, stood as the natural heir. Charismatic, accomplished, and beloved by the Janissaries, He posed the greatest threat to the ascension of Roxelana's sons. In 1553, during a campaign in Persia, Suleiman summoned Mustafa to his tent and ordered his strangulation by palace guards. The order shocked the empire. How could a father murder his own son? And more pointedly, why now? The official charge was treason, whispers of correspondence with Persian enemies, plots to seize the throne. But the evidence was murky, the confessions extracted under torture, and the outcome brutally final. Some say Suleiman acted out of paranoia, others that he was manipulated by those who stood to gain from Mustafa's death. At the center of every suspicion stood Roxelana, her hands unseen but her ambition unforgotten. Did she truly fear that Mustafa would one day execute her sons, as Ottoman fratricidal custom permitted? Did she whisper warnings into Suleiman's ear, weave a tale of betrayal from threads of loyalty, and ensure her children's path to the throne was cleared with a rope? Or was she merely a mother protecting her own in a system that had long demanded blood for blood, a woman who understood the cost of survival and paid it before someone else made her the price? The irony was sharp. Mustafa, the warrior son born of an earlier love, was undone not on the battlefield but by a mother's will. And his mother, Mahidevran, lived to see her child's lifeless body returned in silence, her title hollow, her legacy erased. Roxelana did not gloat. She did not need to. Her sons were now undisputed contenders for the throne. The harem, once divided by lineage and loyalty, now moved under a single banner. And the empire, for all its power, had been irrevocably altered not by war nor decree, but by a woman who had learned that in the Ottoman court, survival was not a virtue. It was a victory bought with blood. It began as a flourish of ink beside a royal signature, a small emblem pressed into wax, delicate yet defiant, bearing the mark of a woman who had no official rank beyond consort, yet whose will coursed through the arteries of empire like a second heartbeat. Roxelana, now more than beloved, more than wife, began affixing her seal to letters that carried the weight of imperial thought. These were not private messages of affection or ceremonial greetings. They were correspondences of state, to provincial governors, foreign monarchs, religious authorities. Her emblem, once confined to charitable foundations and mosque commissions, now appeared beside or even in place of the Sultan's own, and the court, ever vigilant, took note. The Grand Vizier, once the empire's most powerful man after the Sultan, now found decisions preempted by her suggestions. When petitions arrived, they no longer passed only through bureaucratic channels, they were rerouted through the harem, where Roxelana's scribes transcribed, interpreted, and filtered what deserved the Sultan's attention. She became not merely an influence on power but an instrument of it, her hand pressing closer and closer to the reins of empire. Suleiman, aged by war and grief, no longer questioned the intrusion. He welcomed it. Her mind was sharp, her counsel soothing, and in her presence he found clarity or the illusion of it. Yet with every decree shaped by her input, every seal echoing hers, the singular voice of the empire became a duet. No longer was he the solitary pillar of decision. His authority, though intact, was no longer indivisible. It had been shared, not seized, not stolen, but seated, inch by inch, beneath the weight of affection and habit. The Ottomans, long governed by precedent and male lineage, now watched as a woman with no dynastic claim began to speak with a voice indistinguishable from the throne's. Roxelana blurred the border between consort and co-sovereign, and in doing so, rewrote the architecture of power. She did not wear a crown, but her seal bore one. She did not sit in the divan, but her directives moved through it like wind through a lattice, screen-shaping, cooling, eroding. Ambassadors who once sought only the Grand Vizier's ear now offered tribute to her. Ministers framed policy with an eye toward her favor. And through it all, she maintained the fiction of support not command. The empire was still Suleiman's, of course. But with every document that bore her touch, it became less his alone. The seal, small, circular, pressed in wax, became the symbol of a silent transformation. Power, once singular, was now plural. And the man once called the Magnificent now stood not above his court, but beside a woman whose ascent had begun in chains, and who now wrote history with a pen dipped in velvet and iron. Where most concubines vanished into footnotes, Roxelana etched her name into stone. Across the empire, from the heart of Constantinople to the sacred cities of Mecca and Jerusalem, her legacy rose from the earth in minarets, domes, and arc-excellent, immovable testimonies to a woman who had mastered not only the language of the court, but the architecture of eternity. These were not mere acts of piety, they were declarations public, enduring, and imperial. Her most visible creation, the Haseki Sultan complex in Istanbul, was no simple mosque. It was a symphony of purpose, a place of worship, yes, but also a hospital, a soup kitchen, a school, and a public bath. It fed the poor, healed the sick, educated children, and cleansed the body, a cradle-to-grave embrace of the Ottoman subject under the arms of a woman who had once been enslaved. Each stone carried more than weight, it carried a message, that Roxelana's power extended beyond the harem, beyond Suleiman's court, into the lives of the people, into the sacred geography of Islam. Her foundations in Jerusalem were even more symbolic. To build in that city was to stake a spiritual claim, to walk in the shadow of prophets and prophets' wives, and she did so with deliberate precision, framing her image not only as mother to princes but as guardian of the faith. Yet these projects were not merely spiritual, they were political infrastructure, a network of loyalty built from mortar and prayer. The architects she commissioned, the laborers she employed, the clerics she funded, all became part of a web of patronage that mirrored the network of allies she had cultivated in court. Power was not just whispered in the palace, it was carved into marble, tiled in ceramic, and broadcast from the mouths of imams funded by her waqfs. Her endowments came with conditions, often ensuring that revenues flowed into institutions controlled by her loyalists. And every citizen who bowed in prayer beneath one of her domes, every orphan who slept in her shelters, unknowingly entered her sphere of influence. Even in death, she ensured permanence. Her tomb was built beside Suleiman's in the Suleymaniye Mosque, an unprecedented honor for a consort, placing her not only beside him in memory but in the sacred geography of the empire's spiritual heart. In a world where most women were erased by history, Roxelana wrote herself into the skyline. Her monuments stood as both gifts and warnings, generous, magnificent, and unignorable. They whispered the same message her life had screamed. She had come from nothing, but would be forgotten by no one. Just as she had reconstructed the court around herself, she reconstructed the city, blending faith and dominion, mercy and control, into structures that bore her name not just in marble, but in the daily rituals of the empire. She ruled not only with letters and seals, but with stone and shadow, and unlike whispers in the harem, stone did not fade, stone endured. They did not speak her name aloud, not often, at least not without caution, but the silence around Roxelana had grown heavier than any proclamation. From the deepest chambers of Topkapi to the embassies of Venice and Vienna, her influence was undeniable and unnerving, a force cloaked in civility and veiled behind smiles, yet as potent as any vizier's decree. Court officials learned to tread carefully. Their careers, once tethered to lineage or military service, now pivoted on how deftly they navigated the invisible corridors of Hürrem's approval. Grand viziers whispered to eunuchs, who whispered to scribes, who whispered to her, hoping their names would pass her lips with favor and not forewarning. Foreign ambassadors watched with equal parts awe and suspicion. Ogier Ghiselin de Busbecq, the imperial ambassador of the Holy Roman Empire, wrote with astonishment of her sway over Suleiman, describing her not simply as a consort but as a political actor whose crafty counsel guided the Sultan's hand. Others, less diplomatic, hinted at sorcery, Eastern enchantments, or witchcraft, a Western reflex, to explain away a woman's rise in a world designed to bury her. The bridle of the Sultan's will is in her hands, one Venetian observer recorded, a phrase laced with both admiration and alarm. To some, she was a Marvella symbol that intelligence and will could bend even the most rigid systems. To others, she was an omen, a warning of imbalance, the embodiment of unnatural power. The Ottomans, though masters of empire, were not immune to such fears. The Sultanate was founded on male continuity, on the rotation of concubines and the purging of female influence after a single son. Roxelana had demolished that rhythm. Her continued presence, her marriage, her children's elevated status all had fractured the traditional architecture of succession. She did not simply bend rules, she rewrote them. And yet, the empire held. It did not fracture under her influence, but it quivered. Her power was unspoken in council chambers, but it colored every decision. She was a living contradiction, devout yet ambitious, charitable yet ruthless, cheerful yet calculating. Chroniclers struggled to categorize her. Some painted her as a loyal wife guiding the Sultan toward righteousness, others as a seductress who had ensnared the empire in velvet chains, but none denied her reach. Her face never appeared on coinage, her name was never read aloud at the Friday sermon, and yet her will was stamped across the empire in law, in stone, in blood. She had become a symbol not of femininity, but of female dominion in a world where such a thing should not have been possible, and the empire, vast and vigilant, watched her in silence. For to name her power was to challenge it, and no one dared to speak against the woman who had risen from bondage to shape the course of history. In the marble hush of Topkapi's aging corridors, the woman who had once stirred the empire with a glance now moved more slowly. Wrapped in furs not only for warmth but to guard against the creeping solitude of power's final season. Roxelana, once the storm that rewrote the palace order, had become a fixture immovable, respected, and increasingly alone. Her sons, now governors and military commanders, ruled distant provinces in preparation for the inevitable war of succession. The harem, once her battlefield, had grown quiet beneath her command, its younger women raised under her systems, her values, her legacy. Yet with the empire secure and Suleiman growing older, her influence, though undiminished in scope, became tinged with stillness. The Sultan himself, once the warrior poet who had loved her with the fire of rebellion, now aged into melancholy, preferring seclusion, writing verses of loss, faith, and inevitability. Their moments together remained private and tender, but their courtship, once scandalous and volatile, had softened into ritual. Roxelana continued to oversee the charitable foundations bearing her name, adjusted appointments through the web of alliances she had spun over decades, and kept a close hand on the scribes who drafted imperial correspondence. But she no longer appeared in the same way, no longer walked the gardens with that same daring lightness, no longer watched the court with the same fire. Illness crept into her limbs, yet she showed no weakness before servants or rivals. She had built too much to let it be undone by whispers of decay. Still, the court felt it. The courtiers sensed a change in air, a loosening of the once tight grip. Eunuchs who had served her for years now looked past her toward the uncertain horizon of a post-Roxelana order. Foreign ambassadors, while still deferential, wrote less frequently of her movements and more of her legacy. The silence that had once protected her now began to encircle her. Her greatest triumph, her marriage, her control of the harem, the monuments that bore her nominal, seemed not only victories but burdens, milestones marking the passage of time that even she could not stop. In the palace gardens, where once her laughter had echoed like defiance, now only the birds responded. She remained politically vigilant until the end, watching for cracks in her family's claim to the throne, for threats that might undo her son's chances. But there was no longer new ground to conquer. She had risen from the chains of slavery to sit beside the empire's greatest ruler, had seen rivals exiled or destroyed, had placed her bloodline in the path of power. There was only one thing left to vanish with dignity. Her servants whispered prayers more often now, not in fear but in reverence. The palace had begun to feel like a mausoleum in waiting. And somewhere beneath the gold leaf ceilings and perfumed tapestries, the woman who had ruled without title and commanded without crown began to prepare for her final act, not as a queen, but as a shadow that would never leave the empire she once ruled. It came in spring, when the jasmine bloomed too early, and the air in Topkapi turned heavy, not with perfume, but with the scent of endings. Roxelana, the cheerful one, the slave who had risen to become queen in all but name, died on the 15th of April, 1558, and in that moment, the harem exhaled a breath it had been holding for decades. Her body, once adorned in silks and confidence, now lay cold beneath imperial linens, her face veiled not for modesty, but to shield the court from the final indignity of death's blunt hand. Her skin, once luminous, had yellowed with the slow crawl of illness. Her fingers, once instruments of power, curled inward like petals withering in reverse. The palace fell silent, not the hush of respect, but the hush of disbelief. Servants wept in corners where she had once walked barefoot. Eunuchs who had feared and adored her alike stood motionless in doorways. Suleiman, the Magnificent, the lawgiver, the conqueror, broke. He ordered her favorite garden sealed, its gates shut as if memory itself could be locked away. Musicians were dismissed, their instruments taken and burned in the palace courtyard outs, and tambours and flutes stacked like kindling, their strings shrieking one last time in protest as fire devoured what once soothed the empire. There would be no music in mourning, he declared. Her bedchamber was stripped of color, the silks removed and replaced with black. He recited prayers himself, his voice ragged, uneven, less like a sovereign and more like a man unraveling. For decades, she had been his compass, his counselor, his myth. Without her, the court became a theater without its lead actress, a city dimmed beneath storm clouds. Roxelana's body was interred beside the Suleymaniye Mosque, her tomb built in stone as smooth as the arguments she once delivered through silk screens and scented letters. No other consort had been buried beside the Sultan's final resting place, not before, not since. Even in death, she rewrote precedent. Mourners came not only from the palace but from the streets, those who had eaten from her soup kitchens, been healed in her hospitals, read prayers in mosques she had funded. Yet none could enter the chamber of grief where Suleiman sat alone, surrounded by ghosts and silence, the air thick with the memory of her laughter. The empire still stood, but something within it had cracked an unseen fault beneath marble and power. Roxelana, once a foreign girl torn from her home, had shaped the destiny of an empire, and now, in her stillness, she left behind a vacuum so total it rang louder than any trumpet of war. Her enemies exhaled, her allies mourned, and Suleiman, that colossus of conquest, now stared into the empty space she once occupied, and found it colder than any battlefield he had ever crossed. In the wake of Roxelana's death, the empire did not return to its old rhythm, could not. The precedent she had carved into stone and silk became the template for a new order, and from the shadow of her tomb rose a lineage of women who would shape the empire from behind veils, curtains, and gilded lattice screens. This was no longer an age where concubines birthed sons and vanished into silence. It was the dawn of what historians would later call the Sultanate of Women, a century in which mothers, wives, and daughters of sultans would command policy, orchestrate alliances, and, at times, rule in all but name. Roxelana's life had rewritten the script. Her marriage to Suleiman, her visible patronage, her correspondence with foreign rulers, and her decisive influence in matters of war, succession, and reform transformed the harem from a sanctuary of containment into a crucible of power. The harem, once seen as the endpoint of female agency, became instead its epicenter. Her daughter Hürrem would rise as a power broker in her own right. Her grandsons would ascend thrones that bore her blood, and her descendants, most notably Kösem Sultan and Turhan Hattus, would continue the architecture she had built, ruling as regents, advisors, and silent monarchs behind child emperors and distracted sultans. What had been unprecedented under Roxelana now became expected. Her influence reshaped the architecture of dynastic politics, softening the harsh contours of fratricide, creating new rules of succession, and institutionalizing the political presence of women as maternal guardians of imperial stability. Chroniclers, once scandalized by her presence, began writing about female sovereignty with grudging familiarity, and even foreign envoys adapted, learning to navigate the dual cortone of men, visible and ceremonial, and one of women, private and decisive. She was not an anomaly but a beginning, the first storm in a season of tempests. Her rise had exposed the myth that the harem was apolitical, and in its place revealed a second palace, quieter but no less powerful, where decisions were shaped not with swords but with whispers and silken correspondence. Roxelana's legacy was not merely her monuments or her children, but the reshaping of imperial womanhood from passive ornament to active participant, from mother of princes to maker of policy. The empire's greatest shift had not come from conquest or rebellion, but from a woman once enslaved, whose only weapons were wit, patience, and an indomitable will. By the time the next century drew to a close, no one questioned the power of a sultan's mother. They expected it. And thus, the empire she had entered in chains became the very stage on which her successors reigned, cloaked not in crowns but in influence, because Roxelana had shown that true sovereignty, when wielded by a woman, needed neither title nor throne to endure. History remembers her with divided lips, half in reverence, half in suspicion. Was Roxelana a cunning manipulator, weaving poison into prayer, whispers into commands? Or was she a brilliant survivor, a woman who refused to be erased by a system that demanded her silence? She was both the rose and the thorn, smiling as she dismantled the very traditions that sought to contain her. Her beauty softened her ambition, but it did not define it. Her laughter masked a mind trained by captivity to count each breath, each rival, each opportunity. She built hospitals and orphanages with the same hands that signed letters condemning enemies. She fed the poor while watching princes die to secure her bloodline. Power, to her, was not a luxury, it was insurance against oblivion. And for that power, she paid in solitude, in suspicion, in the slow erosion of identity until she was no longer the girl from Ruthenia, nor merely Hürrem the cheerful one, but a myth draped in contradictions. Her story forces us to confront a darker mirror of empire. When the slave becomes sovereign, is it the triumph of the human spirit or the ultimate corruption of it? She ruled through absence as much as presence, through what she allowed to be seen and what she ensured remained hidden. Her children bore the empire's future, but her legacy bore its unspoken question. What does it cost a woman to rule in a world that insists she never can? Roxelana rewrote the script of power, but the ink was mixed with tears and blood. She reimagined female agency within the iron cage of imperial masculinity, not by breaking it, but by slipping through its hinges and making the cage her throne. She changed the empire. Yes, but the empire changed her more, shaping her joy into calculation, her faith into policy, her tenderness into strategy. And when she finally lay beneath the stone dome beside the man who had made her rise possible, there remained only the silence of marble, the echo of decisions made behind curtains, and a legacy that stretched far beyond the sum of her acts. In the end, she wore no crown, but ruled all the same. So we ask, not with certainty, but with awe, when a slave commands the Sultan, when her seal shapes law and her hand bends history, who truly wears the crown? Is it the man seated on the throne, or the woman he dares not defy?